I spent my entire adult life getting paid to assume the absolute worst about human beings. But the one time I decided to blindly trust someone, it cost me everything I own. My name is Adrian. I am 62 years old, and when I retired to Mexico at 58, my wedding gift to my new wife was the legal right to ruin me entirely. For 30 years, I worked as a private investigator in Baltimore, a city that wears its rust and its secrets right out in the open if you know exactly where to look. My days and nights were an endless blur of telephoto lenses, cold coffee and unmarked sedans, and the quiet devastation of handing a man or a woman a manila folder containing the photographic proof that their marriage was a lie. I saw every variation of betrayal imaginable, tracing the hidden assets of corrupt local politicians and tracking the subtle, careless mistakes of spouses who thought they were infinitely smarter than they actually were. It was a career that paid well but exacted a heavy toll on my soul, slowly eroding my capacity to believe that anyone was capable of unconditional honesty. The constant exposure to the underbelly of human relationships turned me into a cynic of the highest order, a man who documented his own life with the same sterile detachment he applied to his case files. The Baltimore winters only deepened this internal freeze, the biting wind off the harbor slicing through my wool coats and making my joints ache with a premature stiffness that made getting out of bed feel like a punishment. I lived in a sparsely furnished apartment in Fells Point, entirely devoid of sentimental attachments, functioning more like a holding cell between surveillance jobs than an actual home. By the time I reached my late 50s, the exhaustion was no longer just physical, but rather a profound, suffocating spiritual fatigue that shadowed my every step. I realized that if I did not walk away from the business of watching other people's lives fall apart, I would die in that city without ever having truly lived my own. I wanted sunlight, I wanted simplicity, and most of all, I wanted to exist in a place where no one knew my face, and I did not have to look at everyone as a potential suspect. That desperate yearning for a completely clean slate is what led me to pack up exactly 3 suitcases, liquidate my meticulously managed investment accounts, and board a one-way flight to the island of Colzum. Stepping off the plane onto the tarmac in Cozumel felt like walking into a massive, welcoming embrace of heat and salt air that instantly began to thaw the decades of Baltimore frost lodged in my chest. The island operated on a rhythm that was entirely alien to my highly regimented, paranoid nature, a slow and deliberate pace where the pressing urgencies of the mainland simply dissolved into the turquoise water that lapped against the western shore. I bought a beautiful, airy house on the southern end of the island, far away from the chaotic churn of the cruise ship ports, surrounded by dense jungle foliage and facing a stretch of ocean that shifted through infinite shades of blue depending on the hour of the day. It was in this state of vulnerable, wide-open relief that I first crossed paths with Teresa. She was working at a small, family-owned marine supply store where I had gone to purchase some equipment for a skiff I was restoring, and her presence was utterly arresting. She possessed a vibrant, unforced energy that stood in absolute contrast to the guarded, calculating women I had interacted with throughout my entire career. Teresa was 34, born and raised on the mainland, but drawn to the island by the same desire for a quieter life that had brought me there, and she navigated the world with a joyful pragmatism that I found intoxicating. Our initial interactions were simple, rooted in her patient attempts to help me improve my broken Spanish and my eager willingness to listen to her stories about growing up in a massive, boisterous family in Veracruz. I started inventing reasons to visit the supply store, buying things I absolutely did not need just to spend 20 minutes standing at the counter making her laugh and watching the way the afternoon sun caught the dark amber in her eyes. When we finally began spending time together outside of the shop, the private investigator in me, the voice that had kept me alive and solvent for 30 years, went completely silent. I did not run a background check. I did not look for inconsistencies in her stories, and I actively fought the urge to analyze her motivations because I was so desperately thirsty for a genuine human connection. Teresa made me feel like I was not just an aging, burnt-out shell of a man, but someone capable of starting over entirely, someone worthy of the kind of effortless romance I had spent my life observing from the shadows but never participating in. Our courtship progressed with a speed that I would have cautioned any of my former clients against. But I was entirely blinded by the intoxicating illusion of my own second youth and the sheer relief of being touched with kindness. Within 10 months of that first meeting in the marine supply store, we were standing on the white sand behind my house, exchanging bows in a small, beautiful ceremony, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the Caribbean sky in brilliant strokes of violet and gold. I was overwhelmed by a profound sense of triumph, a deeply rooted belief that I had successfully outrun my cynical past and finally secured a warm, loving future where I could safely lower my guard forever. But beneath that joy lay a lingering insecurity about the nearly 3-decade age gap between us, a quiet, insidious fear that I needed to anchor her to me with something far more substantial than just affection and promises. I wanted to prove to Teresa, and perhaps more importantly to myself, that I trusted her with a completeness I had never offered another human being on the face of the earth. I wanted to definitively kill the paranoid investigator inside me once and for all. So, just 3 weeks after the wedding, I made the irreversible decision that would eventually unravel the rest of my life. I arranged a formal meeting with a local notary public in the bustling center of town, walking through the heavy wooden doors with my new wife by my side. Sitting in that stiflingly hot office, listening to the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan and the rapid rustle of legal paperwork being sorted across the heavy mahogany desk, I voluntarily dismantled the financial fortress I had spent 30 years building. I signed the documents that added Teresa's name to the deed of the oceanfront house, transforming my sole sanctuary into a jointly owned asset. I did not stop there, proceeding to authorize the complex bank transfers that merged my substantial American retirement savings with her local accounts, effectively handing her the keys to my entire net worth without a single protective stipulation. When I handed her the pen to countersign the final page, I felt a massive surge of pride and relief, truly believing that this grand, sweeping gesture of financial surrender was the ultimate proof of my devotion. I thought I was purchasing her permanent security, failing entirely to realize that I was actually just funding my own obsolescence. The shift in Teresa's demeanor did not take years or even months to manifest. It was a terrifyingly rapid transformation that began the very moment the notary's ink dried and the international bank transfers officially cleared. The vibrant, attentive woman who had spent hours walking the beach with me and listening to my stories vanished almost overnight, replaced by someone entirely indifferent to my presence and openly annoyed by my attempts at conversation. The house, which had been a sanctuary of quiet intimacy designed for the two of us, suddenly began filling up with her extended family members from the mainland. It became a revolving door of cousins, siblings, and nephews who treated me not as the patriarch of the home, but as a mildly annoying squatter who happened to be living in their new luxury vacation property. Whenever I tried to assert boundaries or calmly request a return to the peaceful, isolated life we'd discussed before the marriage, Teresa would look at me with a cold, hollow expression that I recognized instantly from 1,000 different surveillance jobs in Baltimore. It was the terrifyingly blank look of someone who no longer needed to pretend to care because they had already secured exactly what they wanted. I realized with a sickening, dizzying drop in my stomach that she had never actually been in love with me. She had been meticulously managing a project, and the project was now successfully completed. She began making massive, unilateral financial decisions without so much as a passing comment to me, withdrawing large sums of money to invest in her brother's failing construction business and purchasing expensive vehicles for her family members. When I finally gathered the courage to confront her about the draining of my life savings, the argument lacked any of the fiery passion or tears of a lover's quarrel. It was brutally and purely transactional. She calmly reminded me, in perfect flawless English she had rarely used during our courtship, that the money and the house belonged to her legally just as much as they belonged to me, and that I had absolutely no legal recourse to stop her from doing whatever she pleased. The brilliant, cynical private investigator who had made a lucrative living protecting vulnerable people from exactly this kind of predatory behavior had willingly walked right into the most obvious trap of his wife, locking the door behind himself and handing over the only key to a stranger. Today I am still technically living in the sprawling oceanfront house in Cozumel, but I exist entirely as a ghost haunting the margins of my own life. I occupy a single small guest bedroom near the back of the property, spending my days listening to the loud music and the sounds of Teresa and her family, enjoying the life that my 30 years of standing in the freezing Baltimore rain paid for. I cannot afford to pack a bag and leave because the vast bulk of my liquid assets have been funneled into private investments and secondary accounts I can no longer access or control. Forcing a legal sale of the house in the complex Mexican court system as a foreigner would take years of litigation and massive amounts of capital that I simply no longer possess. The deepest tragedy of this situation is not the staggering loss of the money, nor is it the loss of the beautiful oceanfront view I'd dreamed about for decades. It is the absolute crushing destruction of my own dignity. I sit on the edge of my bed as the sun goes down, listening to the waves crash against the shore, and realize that the ingrained paranoia I fought so desperately to shed was actually the only thing keeping me safe in a world that preys on loneliness. I wanted so desperately to believe that I was somehow special, that the unforgiving rules of human nature and transactional affection did not apply to me in the twilight of my life, that I willingly ignored every single blaring alarm bell ringing in my head. I traded my hard-won independence, my sanctuary, and the entirety of my life's work for the fleeting, pathetic illusion that I was loved by someone who only ever saw me as an open vault waiting to be emptied. If you are ever tempted to prove the depth of your love by sacrificing the legal and financial foundation of your own survival, I urge you to look closely at the person standing across from you and ask yourself what happens the very moment they no longer need your generosity to survive. Because the brutal truth I learned entirely too late is that you can never buy someone's heart, but you can absolutely hand them the exact tools they need to break yours. I remember a case I worked back in 2006. A highly respected cardiovascular surgeon in Baltimore who had hired me to figure out why his personal wealth was hemorrhaging so rapidly. It took me less than 48 hours of routine surveillance and basic forensic accounting to hand him a dossier proving that his 20-something wife was systematically siphoning his assets to secretly fund her boyfriend's failing nightclub down in Washington. I sat across from that brilliant, highly educated surgeon in a dingy diner off the interstate, watching him weep into his coffee, and I remember feeling a distinct, cold sense of arrogant pity. I thought to myself how genuinely pathetic it was that a man who literally held human hearts in his hands every single day could be so completely, willfully oblivious to the mechanical realities of his own marriage. I judged him harshly for his blindness. But the universe possesses an incredibly cruel sense of humor, because here I am, decades later, occupying the exact same seat at the metaphorical table, finally realizing that crushing loneliness is a far more effective anesthetic than anything they use in an operating room. The blindness does not come from stupidity or a lack of intelligence. It comes from a desperate, starving need to believe that you are finally safe and finally loved. The unraveling of my life in Cozumel did not happen in one dramatic, cinematic explosion of betrayal. It was a slow, methodical dismantling, executed with a quiet precision that I would have professionally admired if it were happening to absolutely anyone else in the world. It started so subtly that my heavily rusted investigative instincts did not even register it as a tangible threat. It began with the physical space of the house itself. When I first bought the property, I was deeply drawn to the vast, empty quiet of it. I loved the wide-open living room that looked out over the water, the sprawling kitchen where I would slowly brew my coffee in the early mornings while listening to the rhythm of the tide hitting the sea wall. Within a month of signing that paperwork at the notary and binding us legally, that sacred silence was entirely eradicated. Teresa mentioned casually one afternoon that her older brother was going through a difficult transition on the mainland and needed a place to stay for just a few weeks while he secured a new job on the island. I wanted so desperately to be the supportive, generous new husband, the patriarchal provider, so I immediately agreed without a second thought. He arrived 2 days later with 3 heavy suitcases and a permanent, unspoken sense of entitlement, moving directly into the primary guest room down the hall. A few weeks after that, it was her younger sister, who supposedly needed a quiet place to study for her university entrance exams, though I never once saw her open a single book. The house, my carefully curated sanctuary, was suddenly vibrating with the chaotic energy of an extended family that operated on a completely different frequency than I did. The television in the main room was constantly blaring shows I could not understand. The kitchen was perpetually filled with the heavy smell of frying oil and loud overlapping conversations that completely excluded me, and my pristine driveway was suddenly home to a rotating fleet of unfamiliar rusting vehicles. I was physically being pushed to the margins of my own home, forced to retreat further and further into the master bedroom just to find a single moment of unbroken peace. When I finally gathered the courage to gently bring it up to Teresa, suggesting that perhaps it was time for her siblings to start looking for their own independent accommodations as we had originally discussed, the mask slipped for the very first time. There was no heated argument, no dramatic shouting match, no tears. She simply stopped folding the laundry, looked directly at me with eyes completely devoid of the warm, inviting light that had captivated me at the marine supply store, and calmly stated that this was her house too now. She told me that in her culture, family was not something you selfishly kicked out onto the street just because you wanted the house to be quiet. She weaponized my own cultural ignorance and my desperate desire to be a good husband against me in a single, perfectly delivered sentence. It was in that chilling moment of pure, unapologetic indifference that the dormant private investigator inside my head finally woke up from his tropical retirement. I recognized that look immediately. It was the exact look of a suspect who knows for an absolute fact that you did not have the evidence or the authority to convict them. That night, after the house had finally gone dark and quiet and Teresa was breathing steadily asleep beside me, I quietly slipped out of bed, walked into my small home office, and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I opened my laptop and logged into my primary American bank accounts for the first time in nearly 2 months. I had been so deeply intoxicated by the romance and the illusion of my new life that I had completely ignored my own golden rule of survival. You always follow the money. The screen illuminated the dark room with a harsh blue light, and as my eyes began to scan the transaction history, the bottom of my stomach simply fell out. I was looking at a financial massacre. The joint account we had established with such pride at the notary was essentially being used as a staging ground for a massive, rapid wealth transfer. There were daily maximum limit cash withdrawals from automated tellers in Playa del Carmen, which meant someone was actively taking the ferry across the water purely to extract my cash in untraceable increments. There were massive 5-figure wire transfers to a local commercial construction firm that I later discovered was owned by a cousin she had never even bothered to mention to me during our courtship. My meticulously managed retirement portfolio, the result of 30 years of standing in the freezing Baltimore rain and dealing with the worst, most deceitful dregs of humanity, was being systematically liquidated and funneled directly into a network of local Mexican accounts that I had absolutely no legal authority to access or freeze. I sat there in the glow of the screen, my hands physically shaking over the keyboard, watching the numeric value of my entire life's work vanish into the ether line by line. She had not just secured her future by marrying me. She had initiated a highly coordinated, brilliantly executed extraction operation, and I had happily handed her the exact passwords and legal authorization she needed to execute it flawlessly. I realized then, sitting alone in the dark, that I was never a husband to her. I was just an assignment. The morning after I discovered the financial hemorrhage, I waited for Teresa out on the patio, the thick, humid Cozumel air settling over my shoulders like a suffocating weight before the sun had even fully risen. I had printed the bank statements, slipping entirely out of the role of a desperate, loving husband and right back into the cold, clinical habits of a Baltimore detective, laying the undeniable paper trail of her betrayal out on the glass table. When she finally walked outside holding a cup of coffee and looking perfectly rested, I braced myself for the standard reactions I had seen 1,000 times in my career: the immediate denial, the panicked excuses, the sudden tears. Instead, she barely even glanced at the papers spread out between us. She took a slow sip of her coffee, looked out at the calm turquoise water, and told me, in a voice completely devoid of either malice or affection, that she was simply securing her family's future, which was exactly what a good husband was supposed to provide. When I lost my temper and threatened to go to the local authorities or hire a shark of a lawyer from the mainland to freeze the assets, she actually smiled at me. It was not a cruel smile, which somehow made it infinitely worse. It was a smile of genuine pity. She calmly reminded me that we were legally married under Mexican law, that I had willingly and voluntarily added her to the deed of the house, and that every single bank transfer had been executed from an account where she held equal, unrestricted signing authority. I was an aging foreigner who spoke fractured Spanish, entirely isolated on an island, threatening to accuse a local citizen of stealing money that I had legally, formally authorized her to take. In that single, breathtakingly quiet conversation on a beautiful sunny morning, I realized that my decades of street smarts and my hardened, cynical edge meant absolutely nothing down here, and that the trap I was caught in was constructed entirely out of my own voluntary signatures. I spent the next 6 months living in a terrifying state of suspended animation, wandering the edges of my own property like a stray dog that nobody had the heart to put down, but nobody had the heart to put down, but nobody actually wanted to feed. The massive, beautiful ocean that had once represented my freedom and a perfectly clean slate now felt like an impenetrable, mocking moat, keeping me permanently trapped in my own catastrophic mistake. My American pension, the monthly financial lifeline that I had spent 30 years building to guarantee my comfort in old age, was automatically depositing into the joint account we had established, and Teresa would immediately transfer the bulk of it into private, inaccessible accounts before I could even log in to pay for my own basic groceries. I was reduced to the staggering humiliation of having to ask my much younger wife for a meager allowance out of the exact money I had bled for on the freezing, dangerous streets of Maryland. Her extended family members, who had by now established themselves as permanent, immovable fixtures in the house, treated me with a bizarre, deeply insulting combination of polite deference and absolute disregard. They would pleasantly say good morning to me in passing as they walked through my living room to cook in my kitchen, casually tossing the keys to the new truck that my retirement fund had entirely paid for. I had become a literal ghost, haunting my own life, entirely invisible and irrelevant unless I was actively standing in their way. I could not sleep for more than an hour at a time, my mind constantly, obsessively running through every single interaction, every dinner, every walk on the beach I ever had with Teresa, desperately searching for the exact moment I should have known she was acting, punishing myself for ignoring the blaring alarms because I was simply too thirsty for the illusion of love to care. The absolute heaviest burden I carried during those months was not the staggering loss of my life savings or the evaporation of my beautiful retirement dream, but rather the profound, crushing weight of my own shame. As a private investigator, my entire sense of self-worth and my core identity had been built around the absolute certainty that I was always the smartest, most observant person in the room, the man who saw directly through the lies and uncovered the ugly, undeniable truth hidden beneath the floorboards of other people's lives. To realize that I had been played so flawlessly, so methodically, and with such devastating patience, broke something fundamental and irreparable inside my mind. It was a suffocating, paralyzing humiliation that completely prevented me from picking up the phone and calling the very few friends or former colleagues I still had left back in the States. What could I possibly say to them that would not sound like a pathetic, tragic cliché? How could I ever explain that the hardened, cynical detective who trusted absolutely no one had moved to a tropical island, married a woman nearly 30 years his junior, and voluntarily handed her the legal right to rob him blind within a single year? The shame was a physical ache in my chest, far more painful than the arthritis I had moved south to escape. I realized in the endless quiet of those tropical nights that my desperate, pathetic attempt to buy a second youth and a guaranteed companion had actually cost me the only thing I truly valued in this world, which was my dignity. I had voluntarily surrendered the legal right to my entire existence because I fundamentally believed that my wealth was the only thing that made an old, tired man worthy of being loved, and Teresa had simply looked at the price tag I put on my own heart and paid it using my own money. I spend most of my afternoons now sitting on a weathered wooden bench at the very edge of the property, as far away from the noise of the house as the property line will physically allow. From here I can watch the massive white cruise ships pulling into the western port, discharging thousands of tourists into the blinding Cozumel sun. Sometimes, through the sheer force of ingrained habit, I bring my old heavy binoculars out with me. I don't use them to look at the ships, though. I use them to watch the expat bars and the open-air cafes lining the Malecon down the coast. I watch the older American and Canadian men my age with silver hair and the distinct stiff posture of a lifetime of hard labor in cold climates, sitting across from beautiful, vibrant young local women. I watch the way these men lean forward, practically vibrating with a desperate, pathetic eagerness to be found fascinating, to be found attractive, to believe that they have somehow beaten the brutal, undefeated mathematics of aging. I can see the exact moment they decide to pay for the entire table, the exact moment they decide to buy the expensive necklace from the wandering vendor, the exact moment they silently convince themselves that their money is merely a tool of romance rather than the entire foundation of the relationship. I want to scream at them across the water. I want to walk down to those cafes, grab them by their sunburned shoulders, and tell them that the warmth they are feeling is not love. It is just the heat of a perfectly executed transaction. But I stay on my bench because I know with absolute certainty that they would not listen to me, just as I would not have listened to anyone else 2 years ago. When a man has been freezing to death in the dark for 3 decades, you cannot convince him that the fire he finally found is going to burn his house down. He has to feel the flames for himself. The reality of my daily existence has settled into a terrifying, quiet routine of absolute submission. I've learned to move through my own house like a shadow, timing my trips to the kitchen for when Teresa and her siblings are down at the beach or running errands in town using the vehicles I finance. I eat mostly cold meals, canned beans, and bread because the physical act of cooking requires occupying space, and occupying space invites the cold, indifferent stares of her family members who view my presence as an increasingly intolerable inconvenience. Last week I developed a severe chest cold, a rattling, deep cough that kept me awake for 3 straight nights. In a normal marriage, this is the exact moment when the vows of sickness and health are quietly honored. But lying in that small, humid back bedroom, listening to the loud music vibrating through the drywall, I realize with a sudden icy clarity that if my heart were to simply stop beating in the middle of the night, it would be the absolute best possible outcome for everyone in this house except me. There would be no grief, only the immediate logistical relief of finally having the master deed entirely uncontested. The terrifying truth about trading your financial autonomy for the illusion of companionship is that you instantly transform yourself from a partner into a living, breathing obstacle to their inheritance. You hand them the absolute strongest financial incentive for your own swift demise, and then you have to wake up every single morning and look them in the eyes, pretending you don't know exactly what they are quietly waiting for. If I could go back to that stiflingly hot notary office in the center of town, if I could sit across from that dark mahogany desk and look at the pen resting on those heavy legal documents, I would not even hesitate. I would stand up, walk out into the unforgiving Cozumel heat, and I would walk back to an empty, quiet house. I would embrace the absolute silence that terrified me so deeply when I first arrived. Because what nobody tells you about the profound, aching loneliness of growing old is that there is actually a fate far worse than being alone. Being alone simply means you have no one to share your life with, but being trapped in a legal and financial prison of your own making, surrounded by people who actively resent your continued survival while spending the money you traded your youth to accumulate, that is a unique, exquisite kind of hell that strips away the very core of your humanity. I am 62 years old, and I am waiting to die in a tropical paradise that I bought and paid for, essentially serving a life sentence in a gilded cage where the warden is my own wife. Do not make the mistake of believing that your generosity can rewrite the fundamental rules of human nature. Guard your independence, protect the sanctuary you have built for yourself, and never, under any circumstances, hand someone the legal authority to destroy you just to prove that you love them. Because the moment you give them the power to ruin you, you are no longer a lover and you are no longer a husband. You are just a target that has finally been successfully acquired.